Hi class, today we're here to talk about chapter 10, which is related to emotional development. So in our last chapter, we discussed language and language acquisition, but an important part of our communication is also done with an emotional component. So let's begin by exploring emotion and talking about what are emotions. Your book defines emotions as a feeling or affect, and oftentimes this is characterized by behavior. So maybe we're reflecting both pleasure or displeasure to something. It's a conscious feeling, so we have a very specific or intense feeling associated with it. And then it's also associated with psychological arousal. So it's happening in response to something. Oftentimes, this use of emotions includes our communication with the world, and it's not necessarily something that is spoken or written or verbalized, right? So remember during our lecture last week, I had given you this example of, yeah, I'm fine. The words that I might be conveying are very different than the emotion that I'm also putting into that sentence, right? Which communicates something completely different, which is, I'm not fine. Maybe I'm irritated, right? And so we actually use emotion to convey quite a bit of meaning. Biological components or biological roots are a really essential part of emotions and how emotions develop. The way in which we evidence emotion is very much shaped by our culture and our relationships. Oftentimes, facial expressions are going to be some of those most basic emotions that we can evidence. Because these basic emotions tend to be seen cross-culturally, we assume that there is a biological component that's associated with emotion. However, when we evidence this emotion, where we do it, how we express it, these aren't actually culturally universal. So this is why in the United States, we can have individuals who are really great at recognizing anger, but I could go to another country that doesn't typically evidence anger, and it's not so easily picked up, right? Maybe it's only used in very specific contexts. A key dimension of development then is effectively managing our emotions. And we call this emotional regulation. So while individuals are capable of having a wide range of emotions, how we choose to regulate that, or our ability to regulate that, is something that we learn over time. In fact, some of the ways that we responded to perhaps being upset when we were younger would definitely not be socially appropriate when we're older. So when we're younger, somebody takes your toy away, you go over that to them, you scream "mine," and you take it back from them. If we did something like that as an adult, that would probably be a little bit weird. So we come up with strategies to help us cope with that emotion. Now, some things might be really intense for us and we might have a hard time regulating that emotion. We may get better with it over time. We also may be better at regulating emotions in one domain versus another, right? And this is oftentimes very individual specific. So in terms of regulating our emotions in infancy, we are often taught to regulate our emotions, or that regulation is occurring through external sources, perhaps through a parent or caregiver, right? Oh, they're there, don't cry, it's okay. we do this a lot with my son where he's upset or he's frustrated, and we try to help him articulate what he's being upset or frustrated about. So we know that it must be really, really disappointing that you don't get to throw that spoon across the floor, right? So here we're kind of helping him label what might be causing him distress and what he's so agitated and upset about in the moment. Our hope is by doing this, by providing these kind of context or examples of how to regulate that behavior, as he gets older, number one, he won't throw spoons across the floor, but two, that he himself is able to cope and manage that feeling when he's frustrated, that he's able to use maybe some of that internal monologue of, I think I'm really upset right now because I'm not able to do X, right? So that is really great in helping build that emotional regulation. In general, we tend to have something called primary emotions. This is a set of six emotions that we often all have: joy, anger, sadness, fear, disgust, and interest. We call these primary emotions. They're present in human beings, but we also actually see them in non-human animals as well. And they tend to appear during the first 6 months of life. So something that we actually see pretty early on. We can tell when a child is upset, right? Or angry or disgusted. But how do we express that emotion in infancy? Well, frequently this happens through crying. Our last chapter, we talked about crying a little bit, the difference between a basic cry or an anger cry versus a pain cry. But this tends to be the most important mechanism for communication for us. Initially, it indicates our feelings. We can't say, I'm sad, right? Or I'm in pain. Instead, we evidence a cry. And what's really fascinating is that we don't just have one type of cry. We have different types of cries. Parents tend to be pretty good at distinguishing different cries. Interestingly, if we kind of play these types of cries, or we play different cries for just everyday people, most are pretty good at picking out like an anger cry, like that baby is angry, right? And so there are just some facets of crying that tend to be widely understood, regardless of whether or not you actually have a child. Across the board, though, parents tend to be kind of the best at picking out the different types of cries. And my guess is that it just relates to that experience. We also smile, which helps us bond with our caregivers and is also used as a form of communication. We have two different types of smiles, a reflexive smile and a social smile. A reflexive smile is something that is exactly as it sounds, reflexive. We aren't controlling it. So I hate to break it to you, but when you give birth to your baby and you're holding your baby and the baby is smiling and you think, oh my gosh, my baby's smiling at me, chances are that is a reflexive smile. It's just taking place. Now, soon thereafter, we do have what we call a social smile. And this is when the child is engaging purposefully in that smile response. And so now this is in response to something that might be considered pleasurable or to engage with the caregiver. And so this is really quite neat that we have different types of smiles, but that smiling, even though we see it early on and we see it with infants, that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's purposeful. This doesn't happen until a little bit later after we're born. In early childhood, when we're looking at that emotional development, our young children are going to experience a whole range of emotions. So we're going to move from those primary emotions and move into what the research literature calls self-conscious emotions. So this is related to things like empathy and jealousy and pride and shame and guilt and embarrassment. But in order for us to have these secondary emotions or self-conscious emotions, we first need to have acquired self-awareness. So these emotions typically don't appear till about 18 months of age. By the time we get to ages 2 through 4, now children actually have a lot of different vocabulary words to describe their emotions, right? So it's not just I'm sad, right? I'm not feeling all that great, or, this doesn't make me happy, and these are the reasons why. Our kids are also starting to learn about causes of the emotions and also the consequences of those emotions. So if they're angry and they're unable to control that anger, what's the consequence of that? Maybe it's timeout, maybe it's removal of a toy, right? Whatever that might be. By ages 4 to 5, we're getting even better, right? We're able to reflect on those emotions, and we're making improvements in terms of that emotional understanding. Our management of emotions are also getting much better as well. And for parents, this is very welcomed typically. Moving into kind of childhood, or in this case, kind of looking at older children, our older children now have coping alternatives, or they have kind of learned coping alternatives. And because they've learned more coping alternatives, they're more effective as using these as strategies, right? So now you've got more of this intentional shift of how they're processing those feelings or the thoughts they have. Most children by age 10 are very good at using these different types of strategies. However, our family context plays a role here. Our environment plays a role here. So, typically not having very supportive families or experiencing some extremely traumatic event can lessen our abilities in this emotional kind of regulation, or these cognitive strategies to help us with that emotion. So there are lots of recommendations we have for helping children sort of cope, particularly with maybe stressful events. And these range from reassurance to the child, all the way to really walking through and helping a child make sense of the event that's taking place. Moving into adolescence, thinking about our emotions, adolescence is oftentimes characterized as this time period of storm and stress. It's important to consider that this is definitely a stereotype, and even if there is this up and down in emotion, it's not constant. So a lot of times the emotional changes that are taking place aren't just happening in a vacuum, right? I'm not just sitting here or kind of backing up to our adolescent. Our adolescent isn't just sitting there and all of a sudden they're happy and then they're sad and then they're mad, right? And then they're melancholy, right? That's not how that works. Typically, there is some kind of provocation for that emotion. And really helping adolescents process that piece can allow them to really work on that emotional regulation even as they get into adolescence. Girls overall tend to be much more vulnerable to depression than our boys. Having a little bit of that moodiness is normal in adolescence within reason. Now, if you've got these huge, big mood swings, that might be something that you'd want to talk to your healthcare professional about. But you have to remember that there's a lot going on in adolescence, both cognitively, but also physically as well. So going through puberty can also impact, the fluctuation in hormones can impact some of that emotion or moodiness that we've talked about. So kind of taking a look at maybe just some of the differences. This is a chart looking, and these are self-reports. So this is very happy, very unhappy, and very happy. And you've got fathers, mothers, and adolescents. You tend to see that, this line here, this very happy, right, is much bigger. The very unhappy, not in so much range. But of course, when you're going from here to here, for an adolescent, that probably seems like a really big sort of drop off. What about our adults? What does that emotion look like as we move into adulthood? Well, our adults are actually much better able to adapt, particularly when they have that high emotional intelligence. This is something that we can teach. It's something that we can help cultivate. And we can do this from the time that a person is an infant or a child. There are developmental changes that continue to occur as we get into adulthood. Overall, however, our older adults have much more positive emotions, and they're also better able to control those emotions, right? So there's a lot fewer of those up and downs as compared to what we saw in this graph with our adolescents. You can kind of take a look at positive and negative emotions here. So taking a look at that positive emotion as compared to our negative emotion as we age, right? So there actually is even more of a drop off with negative emotion and sort of a slight increase with that positive emotion. We tend to have much more positives than we do negatives. And that's really great, right? It allows us to kind of feel good as we're having our day-to-day interactions. And the last thing I kind of want to leave you with in this chapter is looking at something called the socio-emotional selectivity theory. And the idea here is that older adults tend to be far more selective about their networks. And so this might account for this increase in positive emotion that we're seeing. If a relationship isn't bringing that positivity, that emotional satisfaction, adults are much better able to kind of cut those out. And so what they're doing is they're investing greater amounts of time in relationships that are meaningful to them and are worthwhile to them, that bring them that positivity. And so this is kind of an interesting model that we see, this theory that we see, and we can actually see it kind of unfolding in front of us in real time. So again, sort of accounting for why we might see this positive emotion. All right, so that gives us kind of a nice quick rundown of our emotional development chapter. As always, I highly encourage you to read very carefully the chapter as a whole. There are a lot of other terms, some greater detail that your book goes into that we haven't captured here.